DiscoverNewport.org.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments over a settlement with Purdue Pharma that would grant billions to states most impacted by the opioid crisis. We'll hear from a local mother who lost 2 sons to opioid addiction on this case and what she wants to see done on the Supreme Court. Then, Massachusetts parents working in the cannabis industry face barriers and challenges those in other industries do not. We'll hear from one of those parents on the changes she'd like to see. It's a showdown of money versus principle at the Supreme Court. The justices have been hearing arguments over an $8 billion bankruptcy deal for Purdue Pharma, the pharmaceutical company behind the highly addictive painkiller OxyContin. Now at stake is whether or not the court will approve the bankruptcy deal, which would allot the billions for the states heavily impacted by the opioid epidemic. But it would shield members of the Sackler family who own Purdue from further legal action against them, something many families of those victims do not support. Well, joining me now to discuss is Cheryl Juaire, who lost 2 sons, Corey and Sean, to opioid addiction a decade apart. She testified against the Sackler family when the settlement was originally reached, and she's also the founder of Team Sharing, Inc., a national organization of parents who've lost kids to substance use disorder. They raise awareness and provide support to other families who've lost loved ones to the disease. And to break down that Supreme Court hearing and the subsequent hearings, we are also joined by Robert Barnes, Supreme Court reporter with the Washington Post. Thank you so much, both of you, for being with me.
Thank you
for having us.
So, Robert, I'd love for you to catch us up to where we are. We know this has been a lengthy legal process, one that's can be very complicated for folks who don't know legalese or in the legal profession. So where are we in terms of the argument that the Supreme Court heard this week?
Well, the court heard oral argument over this plan. As you mentioned, this is a big plan that's been worked out over years. The lower courts were a little split on it. Excuse me. But the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit said that it could go forward. The legal question is whether the bankruptcy code allows this kind of settlement in which, as you say, billions of dollars would go to states and individuals for use in fighting opioid addiction, but it would shield the Sacklers from any further lawsuits. The Sacklers are not part of this bankruptcy proceeding, and that's part of the issue for the court. But the lower courts found that there is part of the bankruptcy court code that says courts can approve such deals if they are appropriate to bring about a settlement in a complicated case. So there is a legal question on the one hand, whether this is actually allowed by the bankruptcy code, and then sort of another question about, is this as good a deal as anyone's going to be able to get from the Sacklers and from Purdue?
So correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, this would protect the Sacklers to some degree from other suits. Once this bankruptcy, the settlement money is being dispersed, it would protect them from other suits, correct?
That's right. Those who are in favor of the deal say that the $6 billion that the Sackler family members are going to contribute to this fund is what makes it work, but that the trade-off for that is that they would be immune from further lawsuits.
Yeah, and some families say that price is too high. Cheryl, I want to bring you in because, as we mentioned in our introduction, you know, this is very personal for you, losing 2 sons. So talk to me a little bit about that. You've been on the show before. Welcome back. And what you think about this latest step in this legal fight.
Well, first of all, I've sat on the unsecured creditors committee. So I've watched this whole thing unfold for the past 4 years. When I first joined the unsecured creditors committee, my thought process was, great, I'm going to help bring the Sacklers down because back in 2018, when Attorney General Maura Healey filed a complaint against the Sacklers, and I learned about Purdue and OxyContin and the Sackler family, I made it my mission to bring them down. We worked for 2 years to come up with a plan on the creditors committee with 50 attorney generals and the debtors and creditors and hospitals. And we worked really, really, really hard. And I learned that most likely they were not going to go to jail. And so the best plan that we came up with, and even though it started at $2 billion, we ended at $6 billion. We decided that that was probably going to be the best plan out there or offered. My thought process on this also is that there's no amount of money that's going to bring my kids back or any of these children's back, but we need to start saving lives now. We need to take that money and we need to start saving lives.
Cheryl, tell me a little bit about your boys and the impact this has had on your family.
Well, I had 3 sons, and I lost Corey in 2011. And back then I didn't know anything about OxyContin or his addiction. And he tried to explain it to me and I didn't know anything about it. I just thought it was a choice. And I've learned so much since. Sean was addicted as well. They used to do drugs together. And then Sean got into recovery, but he never dealt with the loss of his brother. And so 10 years later, he succumbed to addiction.
Yeah. So, Robert, when we're talking about this case and the families, from I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of families were in favor of this bankruptcy settlement. I think the number is 97%, but there are families who don't think this is justice.
Yeah, that's right. The overwhelming majority of those who voted for this plan. The federal government says that there are others who didn't vote, and so you can't really say what they feel about the plan. But the government says that the law simply doesn't allow this, that the bankruptcy code can't shield a family that doesn't actually put themselves up for bankruptcy, and that the Sacklers didn't do that. They, in most bankruptcy cases, those who are involved put everything on the table, as one of the justices said, and that hasn't happened in this case. But as I say, it was very much during the oral argument a case between sort of practicality and the law, and you could see that a number of the justices were torn about this and whether there really was a better deal available out there if this one was turned down, or whether, it would just turn into something where each creditor would try to get some sort of award against Purdue or the Sacklers, and that would sort of take all of the money and there would be none for all of the others out there. I mean, the actual estimates of the charges against them, the claims against them, is $40 trillion. And so obviously there is no way to recover all of that money.
Yeah, we actually have some data chart here that sort of highlights the opioid-related overdose deaths just in Massachusetts. And if this settlement goes through, Massachusetts getting some money to deal with that, showing that there has been a steady increase as we go from 2000 to 2022. You can see the numbers right there. The Sacklers implicated in this spike of opioid deaths. And so, Cheryl, I'm thoughtful about this is some money. It certainly isn't all the money when we're talking about $42 trillion. Does this feel like justice to you, to your boys, and to the families in Massachusetts that you know?
If we can take that $110 million and put it to good use in Massachusetts, yes, it would be that my children did not die in vain. If we let this money go, there's no hope out there. There's no hope. The Sacklers, there'd be a mad race to the courthouse to see who gets what first. In this plan, 50 attorney generals sat there, and there was a formula on how much each state was going to get. And it was by overdose deaths in each state. So let's just say California is going to get 357 million and Massachusetts 110. If this doesn't happen, Massachusetts might get 1 and California nothing. I mean, so there's a plan in place, and it makes sense. I sat on the committee, I know, and it's been 4 years. And you know how many people have died in these past 4 years? Hundreds of thousands, while we're bickering over money.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say, I'm a woman of faith. And so they're going to have to one day stand in front of the ultimate judge. And they're going to have to answer to him. And so if they don't get their due diligence here on earth, I'm counting on the other side.
Yeah. Robert, one of the other arguments that were presented in the court as well, it has to be with this definition of bankruptcy and bankruptcy protection. And if it's stretched here, you mentioned a little bit about that, but also if this will open up the door to other companies perhaps not settling or not going into bankruptcy protection in the future because of what could be the outcome of this case. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there was talk about that at oral arguments. It's a little unclear how it would play out, and it's always difficult in these kind of cases to say how it would affect other cases until we know what the Supreme Court is going to do. But, there are settlements, for instance, against Boy Scouts for abuse there. There were settlements against the Catholic Church that involved some of these kinds of trade-offs. I think both of those could be impacted by the ruling in this case if the court goes the other way. Lawyers in both of those cases file briefs with the Supreme Court pointing that out. And so you're right that it is about this case, but it's also could be about some of the other huge and sort of complicated, complex settlements that have gone before it.
And I understand the Sackler family actually took a large sum of money. I think the number was $11 billion out of the company, or $1 million out of the company before this settlement was put in place. And I know that was an issue for some of the families.
And for the justices too, I
Yes.
would say. They asked about that. The Sacklers say that half of that money went for taxes. But I don't think anyone would dispute that the Sacklers haven't put, as I said earlier, everything on the table. So that was a concern for the justices. As I say, it's a very complicated case, and your guest has made the case far better than I could about why it is so troubling and complex and complicated. But she certainly speaks well for those unsecured creditors and even for Purdue Pharma in saying why this is the best deal that they think they can get.
Cheryl, talk to me about what it was like, and you touched upon this a little bit, but being in that room for 4 years fighting for this deal. What don't folks on the outside know what happened there?
It was actually 2 years until the plan was confirmed, but with appeals, it's been 4. So yeah. I've had to sit through hearings in front of the Sacklers. I've had to listen to their testimonies. Richard Sackler on Zoom, almost face to face, was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life because I had to stay quiet. And that was really, really difficult. But I saw there was so much arguing and negotiations and just so much going on inside that nobody knew. And the sad thing was, when I first got on the committee, I was told my fiduciary duty was to be silent. I couldn't speak to the press, or I couldn't speak to my community of supporters. And I just had to say, you've got to trust me in this. And so it was hard not to share all of that happened. But at the end of the day, through the Second Circuit, through all that's gone on, I still believe that this was the best plan that they could come up with. And it took probably a year to get it from from $4 to $6 billion. We don't have that time anymore. We really don't have that time. We're losing kids. As you said, if there's an uptick, we're losing them every day. I lost my son, Sean, while I sat on the unsecured creditors committee in 2021.
Yeah.
So they all saw it. Purdue saw it. The attorneys saw it. The creditors committee saw it. They all knew, and it made me want to fight even harder.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And justice for the Sacklers, putting them in jail is not going to help anybody.
Well, we're going to have to, it's such a complicated case, but we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Cheryl Juaire and Robert Barnes, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Take your kid to work day? Well, not if you work in the cannabis industry. Strict age restrictions at dispensaries and offices prohibit anyone under the age of 21 from entering the premises. It creates a challenge for working parents and for the industry. To discuss this, I'm joined by one of those parents, Nikki John, founder of the Heritage Club, a dispensary in Charlestown, and Cassie McGrath, a healthcare and cannabis reporter with the Boston Business Journal. Thank you so much for being with me, ladies.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Nikki, I think when we talk about this issue, I don't think people think about what kind of impact it could have. So talk to me about what kind of impact it has on you, because you're a new mom, right?
Exactly, yeah. So I had a baby in May, so she's 6 months old. And it's exciting to get back to work, but it's also a challenge of who do I trust her with. And you can find a daycare, you can find a sitter or a nanny or family if that's you have some nearby. But I think the cost of childcare is one of the first things that people think about is what can I afford? So that kind of starts that conversation and how much time can I be away? How much time can I spend when it comes to feeding your children? So for me, all of a sudden I was coming back to work, but I was also discovering something completely new that I didn't really have a guide for. And I reached out to a few other mothers in the industry, and there was no solution. They were like, you can't bring her in. And when you put so much work, blood, sweat, and tears into building a business and then not being able to bring my baby, it's definitely bittersweet. But there are workarounds in terms of having an office space where I can work and bring her with me, but I like to be there on the ground with people, with my staff, with the customers to kind of be a part of what we're building. So I would say that's kind of like the impact, is that I feel a little bit removed from the business because of it.
Yeah. And Cassie, I think this is a piece of a technicality that maybe lawmakers, folks on the Cannabis Control Board, people who are drafting this legislation maybe didn't think about.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's important to start off here by mentioning that, everyone I've spoken to on this issue, from regulators to business owners, are all in favor of keeping the industry 21 plus and safe. I think cannabis is just a stricter and more expensive industry, and in drafting the regulations with a product that's still federally illegal, regulators kind of wanted to err on the side of caution and say, we're going to ensure no one under 21 is on the premises at any point. But there are gray areas and nuances, as we're seeing with Nikki, that can place burdens on new parents.
And we know that in liquor stores, which also has an age restriction, anyone of any age can go in, they just can't purchase the alcohol.
Exactly, yes. So in a comparable 21 plus industry that is liquor, which is something that Nikki actually pointed out to me, minors can be on the premises as long as they don't purchase or possess alcohol. But in dispensaries, as you said, there's those double ID checks. It's making sure, absolutely no one under 21 is on the premises, which again, I think people are in favor of, but I think it can create some complications as well.
And Nikki, the startup costs, we know minimum $500,000 to almost $1 million just to start a single, pot shop or cannabis facility. And then on top of that, not having the flexibility to be able to be on the ground with your employees building it.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's the part that I know it would just change everything if I was able to be there, and I don't know how quickly things can change, but because it is a regulation issue. But I feel like it would change the industry in terms of diversity. This industry is mostly men, so including more women, especially in all workforces. I think there's been a lot of change about whether that's pumping at work, access to time off, PFML in Massachusetts, and how they keep changing that. I think that cannabis, it's new, but for some reason it's behind the times somehow, and it would be really amazing if they're able to find a way to bring this kind of up to speed on that. And even if it's some sort of waiver that they could give out on a case-by-case basis, if they can't change the regs, to be able to allow people to get back in the workplace and also be a part of this new industry.
Yeah, and Cassie, you have a whole equity section of your article there.
Yes, yeah. So it's important to know one study that I looked at projected that it was about $1,700 a month for infant child care in Massachusetts. Cannabis is already, Nikki and I talk about all the time, a very expensive industry, and equity applicants in cannabis often cite that access to capital is the hardest barrier of entry. So another cost on top of that can really close doors on potential great business owners in the state of Massachusetts in cannabis.
Yeah, and you know, we want to throw up a quote from your article where you talk about, like, in Massachusetts, people under 21, they can enter liquor stores. We talked about that according to state law, though they cannot process or purchase alcohol products. But in cannabis, the state law says that, quote, an individual shall not be admitted to the premises unless a marijuana retailer has verified that that individual is 21 years or older. So we talked a little bit about this, but it seems like there has been so many layers that, like, it turns some folks away, you know, because you have ID and checks after another. But we also seeing that the market is becoming saturated. So at some point, do you think that lawmakers and things like that, or based upon your research, need to rethink about these regulations or the way that folks do business?
I think there's a lot of talk in the industry, certainly Nikki and I have talked about it, where when these regulations were drafted, there's sort of this, okay, we've never had this industry in the state before, it's still federally illegal, let's make sure that everything is as safe as possible. When I reached out to the Cannabis Control Commission, which regulates the cannabis industry, you know, I asked them directly, is this something you're looking into? You know, new parents in cannabis and perhaps the restrictions they have in childcare. And, you know, they sort of reiterated that public safety, public health, those are the big priorities right now. And again, I think that everyone's on board with that. I think in this case, like, there are several examples in the cannabis industry of very strict regulations that now the Cannabis Control Commission is actually in its regulatory review period where it will make changes to its regulations. And there's a few examples that, you know, business owners are looking to say, hey, this is a little overly strict. You know, we're in favor of keeping this industry safe, but, you know, this is really expensive on us. This is really burdensome on us. And you know, there's fear of actually some businesses even closing because these regulations are so strict and are really trying to sound the alarm and say, hey, you know, please change this as soon as possible. We're really in fear of, you know, pouring, as you said, like millions of dollars into this business and having it close. And I certainly think that that impact is worrisome to many businesses in Massachusetts.
And Nikki, did you consider at any point, you know, that this might be an issue for you?
Absolutely not. I was thinking part of being an entrepreneur is that flexibility to be able to decide, work from home, coming to work, bringing your kid, like whatever your preference is, that you can kind of decide like what your hours will be. But when it comes to this specific industry, I find that that's not the case. In real estate, like, there's a lot of flexibility with when you do showings or meet clients and things like that, but you don't have that for some reason in cannabis. I find it a lot more restrictive, which was surprising. And during my actual pregnancy, I was at the shop every day and it was fine, but then there just came to a point where I was like, well, now what? And so I feel like I'm figuring it out and I'm there as much as I can be now, but to be able to be there more would mean a ton.
Do you think some of it has to do with the stigma around cannabis?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's this idea that it's completely unsafe. And I think even with the exposure, which that's why it's child-safe packaging, things like that, all the things we can do to mitigate children getting access to it, I think that's super important, but I don't think that necessarily being in the store is going to be how they gain access. A lot of this is things left unattended at home, things that, yeah, it happens with alcohol, but they don't have child-safe packaging. So we are really doing a lot as an industry to keep everybody safe. There's just that question of where's the line going to be, and where can we peel back where it's not going to affect people. We want it to still stay safe.
Yeah, Cassie.
If I may, yes, I think it's important to mention also that there are a lot of child safety laws. Dispensaries have to be a certain distance away from schools, child preventative packaging, as you mentioned. So there are also other protections in place, of course. One of the favorite quotes that Nikki said in our interview was that, JoJo could enter the dispensary when she was in your belly, but not though now. And I think it really calls attention to, just some contradictions, perhaps, and the way things look right now. And I also think it's really important to note that Nikki is a trailblazer in the cannabis industry, the first Black woman and youngest person to enter a dispensary on your own in Boston. And one of the things that we talked about in the interview was, your child won't get to see that. So I think it's important to let people in cannabis be the role models that they are for their families and otherwise.
Yeah, and I think the stigma piece is a big thing. I think of teenagers, sneaking to get someone older to buy them alcohol or things like that. That's not going to happen in a dispensary.
Exactly. Yep. There's a commitment to anti-diversion practices and making sure that people understand, and that is one of the few things that, although they are in terms of cannabis and how they're handling that from a law perspective, diversion there's zero tolerance for, and that's, I think, important. But yeah, the state has to kind of balance all of these things. And I know when they have these open comment periods, they're getting all sorts of comments. They're getting comments from the operators. They're getting comments from people who did have those instances where maybe a child got a hold of something, and they have to find a way to, obviously everyone doesn't ever end up happy, but find the best medium for everyone.
Cassie, where does this stand now? And we all know that the Cannabis Control Commission is going through some turmoils, to say the least. What happens next with all of this?
So yeah, great question. There's actually a meeting on December 14th, and they're expected to take up conversations on a couple of issues. Next in line is probably social consumption, which is what you think of with cannabis, coffee shops, things like that, consuming it in the same space that you purchase cannabis. And then, it's kind of going to be an open field for all types of issues, delivery companies, labs, and testing, and issues as well as this one.
Absolutely. We'll be watching. Nikki John, Cassie McGrath, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that is it for tonight, but do come back tomorrow. We break down what we heard from Harvard President Claudine Gay on how she's addressing anti-Semitism on campus, plus a look at a notorious Boston murder that impacts the city to this day, with the director of the new HBO docuseries about it and a Boston Globe reporter who has been on this case since the very beginning. That's tomorrow at 7. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Crystal Haynes. Have a good night.